Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and we're back to continue our second part of our Comparative Religions series, and we've been talking about Hinduism and the essential four doctrines that make up the entire global pantheistic, polytheistic, mystical worldview that comprises and includes certain religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. And we're sort of going through the evidence for categorizing these world religions as essentially denominations within that single overarching religious worldview. And so far we've determined that Hinduism definitely falls into the category of a religion that is mystical. That was our first doctrine in terms of its approach to knowledge. And second of all, that asserts the idea of a one that is all. And we'll continue to see that type of language described here throughout these various religions. And the next doctrine that we've talked about is reincarnation. So what does Hinduism have to say on reincarnation? Well, according to Britannica, in its article on Hinduism, it says, Hindus generally accept the doctrine of the transmigration and rebirth of, as well as the idea that a being who, after a stay in heaven or hell, is reborn in one form or another, and the whole process of rebirth is called samsara. So definitely the Hindus believe in reincarnation. What about their idea of salvation? What's the definition of salvation offered by this particular worldview of Hinduism? And we'll see it's the same for others as well. According to Britannica, Hindus, the idea is that doctrines encourage the view that mundane life, that is life in this world, is not true existence, and that human endeavor should be directed towards permanent interruption of the mechanism of karma and transmigration or reincarnation, toward final emancipation called moksha, toward escaping forever from the impermanence that is an inescapable future of the mundane experience or mundane existence. So you have this mundane existence, which is your changing, ever-changing rebirth into a new body and existence, and you want to escape from that impermanence towards a different type of existence outside of this physical reality into which we're constantly reborn. They continue here to say that the only possible solution consists in the realization of the kernel of human that the kernel of human personality really is Brahman, which is the one that is all, and that it is their attachment to worldly objects that prevents people from reaching salvation and eternal peace. So you have to realize that instead of being this sort of individual that seems to have been reborn in whatever state you're in now, that instead you are a part of the one that is all, Brahman, and in that internal meditative realization, then you escape from existence in this world which you are frequently reborn into, and you escape from that cycle of rebirths. So that's definitely the Hindu understanding concerning salvation. What about Zoroastrianism? Well, Zoroastrianism, as we've said, we already can categorize very easily as a reformation. In fact, some of the encyclopedia articles we've looked at have used the term reformer or reformation as applied to Zoroaster. And so how do we establish this? We're not necessarily going to talk directly about these four particular doctrinal points of Zoroaster. We're simply going to talk about the historic reality that Zoroaster was a reformer of the existing Indo-Iranian religion that later became Hinduism in India, but in Iran was transformed by Zoroaster at around the same time in the 6th century that we see Buddha and Jainism coming out of reformations in India. So what does Britannica has to say on this concerning Zoroaster and pre-Zoroastrian Iranian religion? It says that the religion of Iran before the time of Zoroaster is not directly accessible, for there are no reliable sources more ancient than the prophet himself. So their religion has to be studied indirectly on the basis of later documents and by a comparative approach. And what do they mean by comparative? They mean that the language of Iran is closely akin to that of northern India, and hence the people of the two lands probably had common ancestors, the Indo-Iranians, and the religion of the latter has been reconstructed by means of common elements contained in the sacred books of Iran and India, mainly the Avesta and the Vedas. Now the interesting point here is that the Avesta is the religion of Zoroaster. So if we find common elements between Zoroaster's religion in the Avestas, and we find those same elements in the Vedas, the sacred text of Hinduism, we're not just talking about commonalities between pre-Zoroastrian Iranian religion, but we're finding commonalities between Zoroastrian religion and Hinduism, where Zoroastrian religion and Hinduism have the same ideas. So this demonstrates further that Zoroaster is really just a reformer of a sort of pre-Hindu Indo-Iranian religion. So what kind of similarities are described here? It says that they both exhibit the same kind of polytheism, many of the same gods, including Indian god Mitra or the Iranian Mitra, the cult of fire, the sacrifice by means of a sacred liquor. It's called Soma in India. In Iran it's called Oama. and other parallels according to Britannica. So very many similar common traits there between Zoroaster and Hinduism, therefore showing that both of them are parts of the same religious system, mystical worldview that Zoroaster is merely a reformer of. So next we're going to turn our attention to another quote from Britannica that sort of summarizes what we've just said. And concerning Iranian religion, it says, and the sources of knowledge of it, it describes the Gathas, which are a portion of the Avesta, the sacred religious text of Zoroastrianism. It says the Gathas contain expressions of Zoroaster's religious vision, which in many ways is a complicated reinterpretation of inherited Iranian religious ideas. He is merely a reformer of the existing Indo-Iranian religious system. So next let's talk about Jainism. This is another one of the religions that sort of emerged in the 6th century BC as after the time of when the Jews had two separate exiles to this area of the world, and it would seem as though the sudden inflow of Jewish documentation and beliefs kick-started some reformations in the century or decades that followed their coming. And so what do we know about Jainism? Well, let's talk about it in the first doctrinal issue, which is mystical path to truth. According to Britannica.com, in an article on Jainism, that those who adhere to Jain ideology must fight against the passions and bodily senses to gain omniscience and purity of soul or enlightenment. So for the Jains, the idea is that you have to fight against bodily senses, seeing, hearing, the way that you gain information through those senses. You have to fight against that in order to obtain what they call omniscience and enlightenment. So an awareness that transcends the kind of information that you get through your senses. The next article here comes from Britannica on Jainism again, and they say that according to Jainism, yoga, the ascetic, physical, and meditative discipline of the monk, is the means to obtain omniscience and thus moksha, or liberation. Now we already saw this term moksha when we were talking about Hinduism, so the common element is there. And they talk about this as this yoga practice is the cultivation of true knowledge of reality. So very much on path here, and the same idea as Hinduism has concerning mystical path to truth. Next, let's talk about the doctrine of the one that is all. So I want to read a couple quotes here and then sort of summarize what they say, because Jainism does not use the phrase the one that is all, which we've already seen used in some of these quotes, but the concepts that it has very much directly relate to it and sort of affirm the basic ideology. So let's start with the book A Brief Guide to Beliefs. And this is written by Linda Edwards, and writing about the Jains, she says this: the extent of Jain mystical doctrines can be appreciated by studying their intricate teachings. For instance, they believe universal life is composed of an infinite number, universal life composed of an infinite number of interacting particles, each particle being jiva or life, an eternal and intrinsically individual consciousness or life. So those are some terms there we're going to summarize here in a moment. And then next, Britannica, commenting similarly, says on Jainism that the Jains believe in the jiva, or soul, or living substance, and they distinguish that from the ajiva, which is non-soul or inanimate substance. The essential characteristics of jiva are consciousness, and in its pure state, jiva possesses these qualities limitlessly. So a pure jiva has unlimited consciousness. So what do we see when we look at Jainism and we combine these different concepts into a whole picture? What we see is that Jainism holds the concept of a universal life that is composed of an infinite number of individual lives, or jivas, which in their purest state, those individual jivas have limitless consciousness. So it seems like there's still this idea of a universal jiva that is unlimited in its consciousness, or an omniscience consciousness that you can attain as an individual jiva when you become pure. So the concepts and the components there are identical. The terminology is a little bit more particular, but the essential picture is the same. In addition to that, the only real difference on this point for Jainism, say in contrast to Hinduism, would seem to be that the Jains divide and distinguish matter, non-living matter, from this all-conscious sort of collective reality of which the individual is a part. And so we'll kind of pause the video here and we'll come back and finish up with a couple more doctrines on the Jains.